I meet Elizabeth on a rainy afternoon 5 years ago, in the middle of a packed city street. She had been standing under a cafe awning, struggling to balance a cup of coffee and an overflowing stack of documents while trying to hail a cab. Her frustration was evident, her caramel eyes darting between the traffic and the papers slipping from her grasp. I don't know what made me step forward that day. Maybe it was the way the world seemed to move too fast around her, or maybe it was the way she muttered a soft curse under her breath, determined but overwhelmed. I grabbed the top few sheets before they could be claimed by the wind, and handed them back with a slight smile. "Rough day?" I asked. She sighed, a mix of exasperation and relief flashing across her face. "You have no idea." That was our beginning, simple, unassuming, yet oddly magnetic. She had a presence that pulled people in, a mixture of elegance and quiet ambition that made her impossible to ignore. I learned that she was an investment consultant, brilliant with numbers, but hopelessly scatterbrained when it came to anything outside of her spreadsheets. She was the kind of woman who could sit in a boardroom full of corporate sharks and outmaneuver them all, yet somehow forget where she parked her car an hour later. I, on the other hand, was the opposite. John, a structural engineer with a meticulous mind and a predictable routine. If Elizabeth was a storm, I was the calm before it, and despite our differences, we fit. She challenged me in ways no one else had. She was spontaneous, dragging me into last-minute road trips or convincing me to try skydiving on a whim, even though I hated heights. I grounded her, making sure she remembered to eat between meetings and forcing her to slow down when she worked herself to exhaustion. For 5 years, we built something that felt unshakable. I was there when she lost her first major client and sat with her on the apartment floor, eating takeout while she vented. She was there when my father fell ill, holding my hand in the hospital waiting room when I thought I would break. We weren't perfect. We had arguments, moments where we questioned each other, but we always found our way back. Or at least, I thought we did. Looking back now, I realized there were small cracks that I ignored, thinking they were nothing more than passing moments of doubt. The sudden, unexplained business trips, the way her phone would light up at odd hours, and how she would glance at the screen before silencing it without responding. The hesitation in her voice whenever I brought up marriage. Her casual "let's not rush things" whenever I hinted at taking the next step. But I was blind. I believed that love, once built, could never be shaken. That faith was shattered the night before our engagement. The man standing beside her in the hotel lounge, the one she leaned into so naturally, he wasn't just some stranger. He was Daniel, her first love, the one who had left her years ago to pursue a career overseas, the one she never spoke about, except in vague mentions of someone from the past whenever I asked. And the way she looked at him that night. She had never looked at me like that, not once in 5 years. That moment, I realized something I should have seen long ago. I was never her first choice. I was just the one she settled for when he wasn't around. And now, he was back. I stood, frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what was unfolding before me. Elizabeth, the woman I had planned to propose to tomorrow, the woman I had spent 5 years building a life with, was standing inches away from another man. And not just any man, Daniel. The way she looked at him, it was a look of recognition, of familiarity, of something that had been waiting just beneath the surface. A look she had never given me. A sharp, bitter taste filled my mouth as I clenched my hands into fists. My heart was hammering, but my face remained eerily calm. I refused to let them see me break. "Elizabeth," I called, my voice steady. She stiffened. The warmth in her eyes flickered for a brief moment before she turned to face me. There was something unreadable in her expression: shock, guilt, hesitation, but not regret. "John, what are you doing here?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. What was I doing here? This was the lounge of the very hotel where our engagement party was set to take place tomorrow. I had come to finalize the last-minute details, to ensure everything was perfect for the woman I loved. And yet, here she was, wrapped in the presence of a man I had never met, but somehow already hated. Before I could respond, Daniel turned toward me, his stance relaxed, a smug confidence in the way he carried himself. He extended a hand, his voice smooth and patronizing. "Ah, so you're John. I've heard a lot about you." I didn't take his hand. Instead, I locked eyes with Elizabeth, silently demanding an explanation. She exhaled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit I had memorized over the years. "John, I was going to tell you. I just when? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Tomorrow? Before or after I put a ring on your finger? She winced, looking away. And that was all the confirmation I needed. Daniel smirked, stepping slightly closer to her, as if testing his territory. John, don't make this harder than it has to be. Elizabeth and I don't. I cut him off, my patience snapping. Don't say her name like that, like you own it. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice hesitant. John, I swear, it's not what you think. I let out a hollow chuckle. Oh, because what I think is that my fiancé is standing way too close to another man, looking at him like he hung the stars in the sky. What I think is that you just told him, I knew you'd come back for me. So tell me, Elizabeth, what exactly am I misunderstanding here? Her lips parted, but no words came out. That single second of silence was louder than any confession she could have made. I turned my gaze back to Daniel, whose smirk had grown even wider. How long? I demanded, my voice dropping dangerously low. Elizabeth tensed. John, please, how long have you been waiting for him? I pressed. How long have I been just a placeholder in your life? Her face paled, but before she could speak, Daniel answered for her. She never stopped thinking about me, he said smoothly. Even after I left, even when she was with you, I was always there. My stomach twisted. I turned to Elizabeth, searching for denial, for anything that could prove him wrong. But all she did was look away. That was the moment I knew. I had spent 5 years loving a woman who had never truly been mine. I nodded slowly, my breath steady even as my world collapsed. I see. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box, the engagement ring I had spent months choosing, the one I had imagined slipping onto her finger with all the certainty in the world. Without a word, I tossed it onto the table between them. The delicate diamond caught the dim light before rolling to a stop. Congratulations, I said coldly. You just saved me a lifetime of regret. Elizabeth sucked in a breath. John, wait, but I didn't wait. I turned on my heel and walked away, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't need to, because for the first time in 5 years, I finally saw the truth. I walked out of the hotel lounge, my heartbeat pounding like a drum inside my chest, but my face remained cold, detached. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, the evening air hit me cool, crisp, indifferent. I inhaled deeply, as if the cold could somehow numb the burning sensation in my chest, but it did end. Single quotes T.it only made the truth sharper. Elizabeth chose him. I repeated those words in my head, trying to make sense of them, trying to let them sink in. But no matter how many times I replayed the scene, her leaning into Daniel, the softness in her voice when she spoke to him, the way she hesitated when I confronted her, I couldn't comprehend it. I had spent 5 years believing we were building something real. I had loved her through her worst days, stayed up with her when she was drowning in work stress, held her hand through every storm. I gave her everything, and none of it was enough. I kept walking, my feet moving on their own away from the hotel, away from the nightmare I had just lived through. My hands clenched into fists as the weight of it all threatened to crush me. Why hadn't she told me? She had so many chances. The late-night conversations, the quiet moments between us. She could have told me. She could have said she still loved him, that she wasn't ready to move forward with me. It would have hurt, but at least I wouldn't have spent 5 years living in a lie. Instead, she waited. She waited for him to come back. I pulled out my phone, staring at the engagement party details that were still saved in my messages. A venue full of our friends and family, waiting to celebrate a future that had just been torn apart. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. What was I supposed to tell everyone? What was I supposed to do now? I thought back to the ring I had left on the table. I had spent months choosing it, making sure it was perfect because I wanted it to be a symbol of our love, of our future. Now, it was nothing more than a wasted gesture. The ache in my chest deepened as my mind spiraled through the memories. I remembered the first time Elizabeth had said she loved me. We had been sitting on the rooftop of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She had looked at me with such certainty, her fingers interlaced with mine. I've never felt this way before, John, she had whispered. Lies. I remembered the times she had leaned into me, exhausted from work, murmuring about our future, about traveling, about starting a family someday. Lies. Had she been thinking about him the whole time? Had I ever really mattered to her? I stopped walking, pressing my hands to my face as I forced myself to breathe. I couldn't afford to break down here, in the middle of a crowded street, surrounded by strangers who had no idea that my world had just collapsed. I needed to go somewhere, anywhere. My apartment. I turned in the direction of home, each step heavier than the last. By the time I reached my building, my body felt drained, like I had just walked through fire. The moment I shut the door behind me, the silence hit me like a tidal wave. And no distractions. No background noise, just me, and the echoes of what had just happened. I sank onto the couch, running a hand through my hair. My chest ached, my stomach twisted into knots. The apartment still smelled like her, like the vanilla-scented candles she always lit, like the faint traces of her perfume that clung to the air. I stood up abruptly, shoving open the nearest window. The cool night air rushed in, replacing the suffocating reminders of her presence. I grabbed a glass from the kitchen, filling it with water, but my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. I set it down before I could drop it, pressing my palms against the counter. I needed to do something, anything. I pulled out my phone, hovering over Elizabeth's name in my call log. Should I call her? Should I demand an explanation? Would it even matter? She had made her choice. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. No, I wasn't going to be that guy, the one who begged for answers he already knew, the one who waited around hoping for a different outcome. She didn't deserve that. She didn't deserve me. I switched off my phone, tossing it onto the couch before grabbing my keys. I couldn't sit in this apartment, drowning in memories. I needed to clear my head. I stepped back outside, walking without a destination, letting the night swallow me whole. For the first time in 5 years, I had nowhere to go, and for the first time in 5 years, I was completely alone. I spent the next 2 days in a haze, avoiding texts, ignoring calls, and keeping my mind occupied with work, anything to drown out the memories of Elizabeth and what she had done. But no matter how much I tried, her voice, her face, the way she had looked at Daniel, it all replayed like a cruel loop in my head. Then, on the 3rd night, she called. Her name flashed on my screen, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But some part of me, the part that still wanted answers, pushed me to pick up. John. Her voice was softer than usual, hesitant. Can we talk? I let out a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay even. Talk? Now you want to talk? She sighed. Please, it's important. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to hear her admit the truth. Or maybe I just wanted to see if she had any regret at all. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, fidgeting with her hands, a nervous habit I knew all too well. I sat across from her, my expression unreadable. Say what you need to say. She hesitated before finally speaking. I didn't plan for this to happen, John, I scoffed. You didn't plan to betray me? She flinched. I never meant to hurt you. I leaned back, crossing my arms. But you did? So tell me, Elizabeth, why am I here? Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, fear? I couldn't tell. But then she dropped the bombshell. I still love you. For a moment, I just stared at her, waiting for the punchline. You can't be serious. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. John, I swear, Daniel showing up, it confused me. I wasn't expecting him. He was my past, and I let myself get caught up in old emotions. I let out a bitter laugh. So, what? I was just a placeholder until he came back, and now that the excitement has faded, you want me to pick up the pieces? She shook her head, her eyes pleading. It wasn't like that. I panicked. I saw him, and all these memories just came rushing back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's you, John. It's always been you. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my body tensed with anger. You expect me to believe that? After what I saw? After the way you looked at him? She exhaled shakily. I made a mistake. I know that now, but I don't want to lose you. Please, John, we can fix this. I shook my head in disbelief. You had 5 years, Elizabeth. 5 years to be sure. And in one night, you proved that I was never enough. Her face crumbled. That's not true. I pushed my chair back, standing up. It is, and you know it. As I turned to leave, her final words stopped me cold. John, wait, I'm pregnant. My breath caught in my throat. I turned back slowly, searching her face, trying to see if she was lying. But there was no hesitation, no flicker of deception, just quiet, heartbreaking truth. You're lying, I said, my voice hoarse. She shook her head. I found out 2 days ago. I was going to tell you. Before everything happened, my legs felt weak, my mind spinning with too many thoughts at once. It's yours, John. I swear. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare. But now, everything was different. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about a future I never saw coming. I stood there, frozen, my mind refusing to process the words Elizabeth had just spoken. I'm pregnant. Everything around me blurred the quiet hum of the cafe, the faint clinking of cups, the murmured conversations of other patrons. None of it registered. I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of a lie, some sort of cruel manipulation. But all I saw was raw emotion, fear, uncertainty, desperation. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. How do I even know it's mine? She flinched, her eyes widening with hurt. You really think I would lie about something like this? I let out a bitter laugh. I don't know what to believe anymore, Elizabeth. You stood there in that lounge, looking at him like he was the love of your life. And now you're telling me you're carrying my child? She swallowed hard. I know how this looks. I know I messed up. But John, I swear on everything, this baby is yours. I stared at her, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave her sitting there with her regret and her excuses. But another part, the part that had loved her, for 5 years felt paralyzed. A child, a future I had never seen coming. When did you find out? I finally asked, my voice hollow. She hesitated. A few days ago, I scoffed. So, let me get this straight. You found out you were pregnant, and instead of telling me, you let me walk into that lounge and see you in another man's arms? Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I was confused, John. I didn't know how to process it. Then Daniel showed up, and everything from my past came flooding back. I wasn't thinking clearly. I shook my head, stepping back. That's not an excuse, Elizabeth. She let out a shaky breath. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but this changes everything. We're going to have a baby, John. Whether you hate me or not, that fact won't change. A heavy silence hung between us. I had spent the last few days trying to piece my life back together, trying to convince myself that walking away from her was the right choice. But now, everything was tangled in a way I couldn't ignore. I couldn't just disappear. Not anymore. I finally pulled out the chair and sat back down, resting my elbows on the table. So, what do you want from me, Elizabeth? She exhaled in relief, as if my decision to stay meant everything. I don't know. I want us to talk, to figure this out. I leaned forward, my gaze piercing into hers. Figure what out? You want me to pretend like nothing happened? You think we can just go back to how things were? She shook her head quickly. No. I know that's impossible, but I don't want to do this alone. Her words settled like a stone in my chest. Did I want to be there for her? Yes. Did I want to forgive her? I didn't know. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to think straight. And what about him? Her brows furrowed. What? Daniel. Where does he fit into all of this? Her expression darkened, and for the first time, there was anger in her eyes. He doesn't. I studied her, trying to gauge whether she was being honest. You sure about that? She nodded firmly. I was confused when I saw him, John. I won't deny that. But after you left that night, I realized something. I didn't love him anymore. Maybe I loved the memory of him, the idea of what we used to have. But the moment you walked away, I knew. Knew what? Her lips trembled as she whispered, that losing you hurt more than seeing him again. I hated how much her words affected me, how much I still wanted to believe them. I stared at her, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. One step forward, and I was diving into the unknown. One step back, and I was letting go completely. Neither option felt safe. I need time, I said finally. Her face fell, but she nodded. I understand. I pushed back from the table, standing up once again. If this is real, if you're serious about this, you need to prove it to me. No more secrets. No more waiting around for something better. She stood too, looking up at me with hopeful eyes. I will. I promise. I hesitated before stepping past her, heading toward the door. Just as I reached it, I stopped and turned slightly. One last thing, Elizabeth. She looked at me, waiting. I met her gaze, my voice firm. Don't make me regret giving you this chance. And then, without waiting for a response, I walked away this time, knowing that whatever came next was in my hands. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I buried myself in work, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, but no matter how much I tried to distract myself, Elizabeth and the weight of her revelation lingered in my mind. She was pregnant with my child, and despite everything she had done, everything I had seen, I couldn't walk away. I had told her I needed time, and she had given it to me. No unexpected visits, no desperate calls, just silence. But that silence wasn't comforting. It was loud. It was suffocating. Because every day that passed, I felt myself standing in the middle of a decision I wasn't ready to make. Then one evening, I got a call, not from Elizabeth, but from Daniel. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I needed to. John. His voice was casual, almost smug. I think we should talk. I let out a dry laugh. We have nothing to talk about. I think we do. It's about Elizabeth. My grip on the phone tightened. You don't get to say her name like that, he chuckled. Touchy, aren't we? I was seconds away from hanging up, but then he added something that made my blood turn cold. I just think you should know that she came to see me. I went still. You're lying, am I? His tone was laced with amusement. She looked conflicted, like she didn't really know what she wanted. I figured you should hear it from me first. A slow, burning rage built in my chest. Elizabeth had sworn she was done with him, that he didn't matter anymore, that she had chosen me. Had she lied? Had I been stupid to even consider giving her another chance? I ended the call without another word, my mind spiraling as I grabbed my keys and headed straight for her apartment. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me, but relief softened her face. John, did you go see him? I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. Her expression shifted. Who? I took a step inside, forcing myself to stay calm. Daniel. She flinched. And in that instant, I had my answer. My heart clenched in my chest. So it's true. She exhaled shakily. John, I was going to tell you. Why? My voice was hoarse, strained. Why would you go back to him after everything? She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't decipher. Because I needed closure. I let out a bitter laugh. Closure? After you spent weeks telling me you chose me? After you said he didn't matter? She stepped closer, but I backed away. I didn't go to him for what you think. I needed to face him. To tell him that I'm done looking back. I shook my head, my chest tight with frustration. You could have told me. You should have told me. She swallowed hard. I was afraid you'd think I was choosing him again. And now? I asked coldly. She didn't hesitate. Now, I know that I never should have hesitated at all. I love you, John, and I'm not letting you go. Her words hit me in places I wasn't ready for. Could I believe her? Could I trust her? I studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt, any flicker of uncertainty. But there was none. For the first time, she looked at me the way she had looked at him that night in the lounge. Except this time, I wasn't a placeholder. I was the choice. I let out a slow breath, my anger beginning to settle. If I do this, if I give us a chance, there can't be any more doubt. No more waiting for something better. She nodded firmly. There won't be. A long silence stretched between us before I finally spoke again. Then we do this, together. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't one of regret. It was relief, and for the first time since that night, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work.